The emergency beacon cut through space like a knife through silk, its desperate pulse reaching across light years in mere hours. Commander Thexani of the Zephyrian Armada stood on the bridge of her flagship, the Crystalline Dawn, watching the tactical display with 4 of her 6 eyes while the other 2 monitored the failing life support systems. Her crystalline skin, normally a brilliant azure that reflected her noble status, had dulled to a sickly gray. Fear, she realized with bitter irony, was not a good look on a Zephyrian. Around her, the bridge crew worked frantically at their stations, their movements sharp and precise despite their exhaustion. The Zephyrians had always prided themselves on their composure, their ability to face any crisis with cool, analytical minds. It was this very trait that had made them the dominant force in the galaxy for 3 centuries. But what good was analytical thinking when faced with an enemy that defied all analysis? Through the massive viewing portal that dominated the front of the bridge, Thexani could see the remains of her once mighty fleet. Ships that had been works of art as much as weapons of war now drifted like broken sculptures. The Radiant Spear, her sister ship, floated dead in space, its hull cracked open like an eggshell. The smaller escort vessels fared even worse. Many had simply vanished entirely, erased from existence by the Devourer's impossible hunger. "Status report," Thexani commanded, her voice steady despite the circumstances. A Zephyrian commander never showed weakness, not even in the face of extinction. Navigation Officer Cathmore turned from his station, his usually pristine uniform torn and stained. 17 ships remain operational, Commander. All with critical damage. The Devourer's last attack breached our reality anchors on 43 vessels. They're gone. Not destroyed, simply gone. As if they never existed. Thexani nodded grimly. The reality anchors were their most advanced defensive technology, designed to keep their ships locked in normal space-time even when faced with the most exotic weapons. The fact that the Devourers had overcome them so easily was proof of their enemy's terrifying power. "Any response to our distress signal?" she asked, though she held little hope. The Zephyrians had made many enemies over the centuries. Most civilizations would likely celebrate their destruction rather than offer aid. Communications Officer Vexara's mandibles clicked together nervously, a sign of extreme stress in their species. "We've received acknowledgments from 17 different civilizations, Commander." "Most are unsympathetic to our situation. The Kragthon Empire sent a message consisting entirely of laughter." "The Stellar Confederacy politely declined to assist, citing our previous disagreements as the reason." Thexani's secondary heart sank. Their arrogance had finally come back to haunt them. For centuries, they had bullied and dominated other species, secure in their technological superiority. Now, when they needed help the most, their victims were content to watch them die. "However," Vexara continued, her voice taking on a note of confusion, "we did receive one affirmative response from a species in the Outer Rim territories. They call themselves humans." Zaxali had never heard the name. What is their technological classification? Do they possess the firepower to engage the Devourers? Vexara's crest feathers ruffled with uncertainty. "That's the strange part, Commander. According to our databases, they're a Class 7 civilization. Barely space-capable. They've only recently developed faster-than-light travel, and their longest recorded journey from their home system is less than 50 light-years. By all accounts, they should be irrelevant." A Class 7 civilization? Thexani almost laughed at the absurdity of it. The Zephyrians were Class 15, masters of exotic physics and reality manipulation. These humans were barely more advanced than the Stone Age primitives that populated most worlds. What could they possibly do against an enemy that had defeated the greatest military force in the galaxy? "Perhaps they misunderstood our message," suggested Tactical Officer Nextor. "Primitive species often respond to broadcasts without comprehending their meaning. Remember the Tribble incident of 2847? Several crew members chittered softly at the reference. It was a well-known story in Zephyrian military circles about a species that had responded to a war declaration with an invitation to a mating ceremony, leading to one of the most awkward diplomatic encounters in recorded history. "No," Vexara said, checking her instruments again. Their response was quite clear. "They understood our situation and are dispatching ships to our location. They should arrive in approximately 6 standard hours." 6 hours. Thexani looked at the tactical display again, noting the slow but steady approach of the Devourer swarm. The creatures moved like a living shadow across space, consuming everything in their path. At their current rate of advance, they would reach the remnants of the Zephyrian fleet in 8 hours. The humans, if they actually came, would have a 2-hour window to perform a miracle. The idea was laughable. Even if every human ship in existence appeared at once, they would be less than gnats before the Devourers. But what other choice did they have? Very well, Thexani said finally. Continue monitoring their approach. And prepare our remaining weapons. If these humans are brave enough to face extinction alongside us, the least we can do is give them a warrior's death.
The next 6 hours passed with agonizing slowness.
The crew worked to repair what systems they could, but it was largely futile. The Devourers' attacks had damaged them on a fundamental level, warping the very laws of physics around their ships.
Their energy reserves continued to drain, their life support systems faltered, and worst of all, reality itself seemed less solid than it should be.
Several crew members had reported seeing impossible geometries in the corridor walls, and 2 junior officers had simply faded away during routine maintenance, their existence unraveling like poorly woven fabric. When the humans finally arrived, it was not at all what Thexani had expected. The first sign of their presence was a series of crude sensor contacts appearing at the edge of the system. The signatures were unlike anything in the Zephyrian databases. Rough, unrefined, almost primitive. But there were so many of them. Hundreds of contacts, then thousands, then tens of thousands. "Commander," Vexara called out, her voice tight with disbelief. "I'm reading massive human fleet movement." They're everywhere. The main screen shifted to show the approaching fleet, and Thexani's breath caught in her throat. The human ships were unlike anything she had ever seen. Where Zephyrian vessels were elegant sculptures of living crystal and exotic metals, these ships looked like they had been welded together in a junkyard. They were blocky, angular, covered in weapon turrets and sensor arrays that seemed to have been bolted on as afterthoughts. They moved with none of the graceful precision of advanced starcraft, instead lurching through space like drunken asteroids. And yet, there were so many of them. The fleet stretched across space like a metal constellation, each ship bristling with weapons that, while primitive, were clearly functional. Missile launchers, particle beams, kinetic cannons. The humans had armed their vessels with every weapon they could think of and then armed them some more. "Incoming transmission," Vexara announced. "On screen," Thexani ordered. The face that appeared on the main display was unlike any she had seen before. The human was clearly male, with short-cropped hair and small forward-facing eyes that seemed to burn with inner fire. His skin was tanned and weathered, marked with small scars that spoke of a violent life. When he spoke, his voice was rough but steady, filled with a confidence that seemed wildly inappropriate for someone commanding such primitive vessels. "This is Admiral Jack Harrison of the Terran Defense Fleet," the human said. "We received your distress signal, Commander. Sorry it took us so long to get here. Had to empty out every shipyard, depot, and parking orbit in human space. But we made it, and we brought some friends." The screen split to show multiple human faces, each representing a different ship or fleet section. Thexani was amazed by the diversity. Humans with different skin colors, different features, different accents, but all sharing that same burning determination in their eyes. "I am Commander Thexani of the Zephyrian Armada," she responded, trying to maintain her composure. "Admiral Harrison, with all due respect to your courage, you should know what you face. The Devourers are not merely powerful, they are antithetical to existence itself. They unmake reality. Our most advanced weapons had no effect on them." Admiral Harrison's scarred face split into a grin that was somehow both reassuring and terrifying. "Ma'am, with all due respect right back at you, we humans have a saying. There's no problem that can't be solved with enough explosives. And we brought a lot of explosives." "You don't understand," Thexani pressed. "These entities exist partially outside normal space-time. Physical weapons cannot harm them. They devour the fundamental forces that hold the universe together." "Well then," Harrison said, his grin widening, "I guess it's a good thing we're too stupid to know that's impossible." Before Thexani could respond, alarms began blaring throughout the bridge. On the tactical display, the Devourer swarm had accelerated, apparently drawn by the massive human fleet. The creatures moved like living darkness, their forms shifting and writhing in ways that hurt to look at directly. "They're coming," whispered Tactical Officer Nexthor. The Devourers sensed the new arrivals. They're moving to attack. Admiral Harrison's expression never changed. "All fleet commanders, this is Harrison. You know the drill. Operation Sledgehammer is a go. Let's show these things how humans deal with bullies." The human fleet began to move, and despite herself, Thexani found herself impressed by their formation. It was crude compared to Zephyrian battle tactics, but there was an underlying logic to it. The largest ships formed a loose battle line, while smaller vessels spread out in a complex three-dimensional formation that maximized their firing angles. It was the formation of a species that had learned warfare through necessity, not theory. "Commander," Vexara said quietly, "long-range sensors are detecting something unusual about the human weapons. They're not just primitive kinetic and energy weapons. They're using everything: nuclear warheads, antimatter charges, gravity bombs, quantum destabilizers, exotic matter shells, and they're firing all of it at once." Vexani stared at the tactical display in amazement. The humans weren't trying to be elegant or efficient. They were simply throwing every weapon they had ever conceived at their enemy, hoping that something would work. It was the most beautifully insane battle plan she had ever witnessed. The first Devourers reached the outer edge of the human formation, their reality-warping presence causing space itself to ripple and twist. Several human ships simply ceased to exist as the creature's hunger reached them. But the humans didn't falter. They didn't retreat. They just kept firing. And, incredibly, impossibly, some of their weapons were actually hitting their targets. A nuclear warhead detonated inside a Devourer, and for just a moment the creature's form solidified as it instinctively tried to consume the energy. In that instant of solidity, a barrage of kinetic rounds punched through its substance, causing it to writhe and shriek in frequencies that made reality itself shudder. "Impossible," breathed Nexthor. "They're actually damaging them." Admiral Harrison's voice crackled over the communications array, calm and professional despite the chaos around him. "All units, target the big one in the center. Hit it with everything we've got. If we can take down their leader, the rest might scatter." The human fleet focused its fire on the largest Devourer, a creature so vast it seemed to eclipse nearby stars. Thousands of weapons fired simultaneously: missiles, energy beams, kinetic rounds, exotic matter charges, even simple chemical explosives. It was a display of firepower that was both magnificent and utterly reckless. And somehow it was working. The giant Devourer writhed under the assault, its reality-warping abilities overwhelmed by the sheer volume of different attacks hitting it simultaneously. Its form began to destabilize, pieces of its essence breaking away like chunks of ice from a melting glacier. But the victory came at a terrible cost. Human ships were dying by the dozen, consumed by the Devourers or simply erased from existence. Vexani watched in horrified fascination as entire squadrons vanished, their crews sacrificed buying precious seconds for their comrades to continue the attack. "Why?" she whispered, not realizing she had spoken aloud. "Why are they doing this? They barely know us. We've never helped them, never even acknowledged their existence. Why are they dying for us?" The answer came from an unexpected source. On one of the communication channels, she could hear human voices coordinating their attack. But mixed in with the tactical chatter, she heard something else. Conversations between crew members, last messages being recorded, prayers being offered to whatever gods humans worshipped. "Tell my wife I love her," one voice said calmly as his ship was consumed by a Devourer's hunger. "Ramming speed," shouted another. "If I'm going out, I'm taking one of these things with me. This is Captain Rodriguez of the Indomitable. We've lost engines and weapons, but we still have a full load of antimatter. Setting collision course with Target Alpha 7. It's been an honor serving with you all." And through it all, again and again, Vexani heard the same sentiment expressed in dozens of different ways. They asked for help. That's enough. For the first time in her long military career, Commander Vexani of the Zephyrian Armada felt something she had never experienced before. Shame. Shame at her species' arrogance, shame at their centuries of bullying and domination, and shame that it had taken these primitive, impossible humans to show her what true courage looked like. On the tactical display, the battle raged on, and against all logic and reason, the humans were winning. The battle had been raging for 3 hours, and the impossible was becoming routine. Human ships continued to pour into the system, wave after wave of crude but effective warships that threw themselves at the Devourers with a ferocity that defied all military logic. Where the Zephyrians had fought with precision and calculated tactics, the humans fought with pure, unbridled aggression, backed by an engineering philosophy that seemed to revolve around the principle that if something wasn't working, you just needed to hit it harder. Commander Vexani watched from her damaged bridge as another squadron of human fighters, if they could even be called that, dove straight into the heart of a Devourer formation. The craft were little more than engines strapped to weapon systems, with barely enough life support to keep their pilots alive for the duration of the battle. By Zephyrian standards, they were death traps. By human standards, they were exactly what was needed. "Commander," Vexara called out, her voice filled with a mixture of awe and disbelief, "I'm detecting some kind of pattern to the human attack strategy. It's not random as we initially thought. Thexani turned two of her eyes toward the communications officer while keeping the others focused on the tactical display. Explain. They're not just throwing weapons at the Devourers, Vexara continued, her crest feathers twitching with excitement. They're testing them. Every time they use a new weapon type, they're monitoring the Devourers' responses and adapting their tactics accordingly. Look at Sector 7. The main screen shifted to show a group of human destroyers facing off against a mid-sized Devourer. The creature's form writhed and shifted as it tried to consume the ships, but the humans weren't fighting it conventionally. Instead, they were using their weapons in sequence. First kinetic rounds to force the creature into solid form, then energy weapons to exploit its momentary vulnerability, followed immediately by exotic matter charges to prevent it from phase-shifting away. It was working. The Devourer was actually retreating, its reality-warping form flickering as it tried to escape the coordinated assault. Ingenious, whispered Tactical Officer Nexthor. They're using the Devourer's own adaptive abilities against them. By constantly changing their attack patterns, they're preventing the creatures from developing effective countermeasures. But even as some human units found success, others were being systematically annihilated. The largest Devourers had begun to adapt as well, learning to recognize human weapon signatures and phase out of normal space-time before the attacks could reach them. Entire human fleets were being erased from existence, their atoms scattered across dimensions that had no names. Admiral Harrison's face appeared on the communication screen, and Thexani was shocked by the change in his appearance. The confident human commander now looked haggard and worn, his uniform torn and bloodied. Behind him, she could see smoke-filled corridors and crew members working frantically at damaged stations. "Commander Thexani," Harrison said, his voice still steady despite his obvious exhaustion, "we need to try something different. These things are learning our patterns too quickly. Do your people have any information about Devourer behavior that might help us?" Thexani felt a surge of respect for the human admiral. Even facing extinction, he was still looking for solutions, still fighting to find a way to win. "Admiral, we've been studying them for months. They seem to exist primarily in what we call null space, a dimension parallel to our own where the normal laws of physics don't apply. They can only affect our reality when they partially phase into normal space-time, but doing so also makes them vulnerable to physical attack. So they have to become solid to hurt us, but becoming solid also lets us hurt them," Harrison mused. "The trick is forcing them to stay solid long enough for us to do real damage." "Exactly. But we were never able to find a way to prevent their phase shifting. Their control over dimensional barriers is absolute." Harrison was quiet for a moment, and Thexani could almost see the gears turning in his head. Suddenly, his scarred face split into that same terrifying grin she had seen before. "What if we don't try to prevent them from phase shifting?" he said slowly. "What if we follow them instead?" The bridge fell silent. Vexara's mandibles clicked nervously. "Admiral, that's impossible. Dimensional travel requires exotic matter manipulators and reality anchors that your species hasn't developed yet. Even we can only achieve limited null space incursions." "Who said anything about dimensional travel?" Harrison replied. "We don't need to follow them into null space. We just need to make sure they can't hide there." Before anyone could ask what he meant, alarms began blaring throughout the human fleet. On the tactical display, a new wave of contacts was appearing at the edge of the system, but these weren't more human ships. They were something else entirely. The new arrivals were massive, easily 10 times the size of the largest human battleships. But where the Devourers moved like living shadows, these vessels gleamed with a light that seemed to push back the darkness of space itself. Their hulls were covered in strange patterns that hurt to look at directly, geometric designs that seemed to shift and change when viewed from different angles. "What are those?" Thexani demanded. Admiral Harrison's grin grew even wider. "Those, Commander, are human industrial ships, specifically our deep space mining platforms, and they're carrying something special." On the screen, Thexani could see the massive vessels moving into position around the battle zone. As they did, they began deploying something from their cargo bays, enormous cylindrical devices that pulsed with an eerie blue light. "Dimensional resonance bombs," Harrison explained. "We developed them for breaking up asteroids in folded space pockets. They work by creating quantum fluctuations that destabilize local spacetime. We've never used them as weapons before, but our scientists think they might interfere with the Devourer's ability to phase shift." Thexani stared at him in shock. "You created weapons capable of destabilizing spacetime for mining operations?" "Well, when you put it that way, it does sound a bit excessive," Harrison admitted. But you should see what we can do to an asteroid field with these things. The mining platforms reached their designated positions and began activating their dimensional resonance devices. Space around the battle zone started to shimmer and warp, reality itself becoming unstable. The effect was immediately apparent. Several devourers that had been phase-shifting in and out of normal space suddenly found themselves locked in solid form, unable to retreat into null space. "It's working!" Nexthor shouted. "The devourers are being forced into normal space-time. They can't phase out." The human fleet immediately took advantage, concentrating their fire on the now vulnerable creatures. Without their ability to phase-shift away from attacks, the devourers were forced to fight in normal space, where human weapons were devastatingly effective. But the victory came with a price. The dimensional resonance fields were affecting human ships as well, disrupting their navigation systems and causing their faster-than-light drives to malfunction. Several vessels began spinning out of control as their inertial dampeners failed. "All ships, this is Harrison," the Admiral's voice crackled over the communications array. "The resonance fields are playing havoc with our systems, but they're hurting the Devourers more than us. All units, switch to manual control and close to point-blank range. We're going to finish this the old-fashioned way. What followed was unlike anything in the recorded history of space warfare. Human ships, their advanced systems crippled by the dimensional resonance fields, closed to virtually touching distance with the Devourers and engaged in what could only be described as a knife fight in a phone booth. Weapons that were designed to engage targets at thousands of kilometers were being fired at ranges measured in meters. Ships rammed into the creatures, detonating their remaining ordnance in suicidal attacks that took out entire sections of the Devourer swarm. Thexani watched in fascination and horror as a human heavy cruiser, its hull breached in dozens of places and its crew probably dead, slammed directly into the largest remaining Devourer. The impact was followed immediately by a chain reaction of nuclear explosions that lit up the battlefield like a newborn star. When the light faded, both the ship and the creature were gone. "Ramming speed seems to be an effective tactic," observed Nexthor with the dry understatement that was characteristic of his species. "It's effective because they're completely insane," Vexar replied, but there was admiration in her voice. "They're fighting creatures that can unmake reality itself, and they're doing it with nuclear warheads and raw courage." The battle continued for another hour, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Trapped in normal space by the dimensional resonance fields, and unable to retreat into null space, the Devourers were systematically destroyed by the human fleet. It was brutal, costly, and completely without finesse, but it was also undeniably effective. When the last Devourer finally succumbed to a barrage of antimatter torpedoes fired by a damaged human battleship, an eerie silence fell over the battlefield. The dimensional resonance fields slowly dissipated, allowing space-time to return to its normal configuration. Emergency beacons from damaged ships began broadcasting on all frequencies, and rescue operations commenced immediately. Admiral Harrison's battered face appeared on the communication screen once again. His ship, Thexani realized, had been at the center of the fighting throughout the entire battle. The human commander looked like he hadn't slept in days, and his uniform was stained with what appeared to be both human and alien blood. "Commander Thexani," he said, his voice hoarse from shouting orders over the din of battle, "the immediate threat has been neutralized. But we're detecting more Devourer swarms moving in from the galactic rim. This was just the advanced scout force." Thexani felt her secondary heart skip a beat. If this had been just a scouting force, then the main Devourer fleet would be thousands of times larger. Even the incredible human armada that had saved them couldn't hope to stand against numbers like that. "How long do we have?" she asked. Harrison consulted a datapad that looked like it had been through several explosions. "Our long-range sensors estimate 3 standard weeks before the main force arrives. But, Commander, there's something else. During the battle, we intercepted some kind of signal from the Devourers, a homing beacon that was calling the main fleet to this location. The signal was coming from somewhere in your ship." The words hit Texani like a physical blow. "What are you saying, Admiral?" "I'm saying the Devourers have been tracking you, Commander. Something on your ship, or someone, has been leading them straight to you, and now they know exactly where to find the rest of us." The implications were staggering. If there was a traitor among her crew, or if the Devourers had somehow infected their systems, then everything they had just fought for could be meaningless. The creatures would keep coming until they had consumed everything in their path. But as she looked at Admiral Harrison's determined face, and thought about the incredible sacrifices people had just made for strangers they had never met, Thexani felt something she hadn't experienced in years: hope. "Admiral," she said slowly, "what do you need from us?" Harrison's scarred face split into that same terrifying grin. "Commander, I think it's time we learned everything we can about each other. Because in 3 weeks, we're going to face the largest military threat in galactic history, and the only way we're going to survive is if we do it together. On the tactical display, the combined human and Zephyrian fleets began forming up into a single massive formation. It was crude and ungainly compared to traditional Zephyrian battle tactics, but there was something undeniably powerful about it. Two species that had never met before today were preparing to stand together against the darkness that threatened to consume the galaxy. And for the first time since this nightmare had begun, Commander Thexani began to believe they might actually have a chance. The next 72 hours transformed everything Thexani thought she knew about warfare, diplomacy, and the nature of intelligent life itself. The combined human Zephyrian fleet had established a temporary base in the Kepler-Populus 442 system, using the asteroid belt as both a source of raw materials and a defensive position. What followed was a frenzy of activity that defied all conventional military protocol but somehow managed to produce results that traditional methods could never have achieved. The humans, Thexani quickly discovered, approached problems with a methodology that could best be described as controlled chaos, where Zephyrian military doctrine emphasized careful planning, detailed analysis, and systematic implementation. Humans seemed to operate on a philosophy of try everything at once and see what works. It should have been a disaster. Instead, it was producing innovations at a rate that made her head spin. She stood in what had once been the observation deck of her flagship, now converted into a joint command center where human and Zephyrian officers worked side by side. The sight was surreal. Her elegant, crystalline-skinned people working alongside the shorter, more robust humans with their bewildering variety of skin tones and facial features. The humans talked constantly, gesturing with their hands as they explained concepts, while the Zephyrians listened with the focused attention of students trying to absorb a completely new way of thinking. "Commander, you need to see this," called out Lieutenant Sarah Chen, one of the human engineers who had been assigned to study Zephyrian technology. The young woman had somehow managed to integrate a human coffee maker with a Zephyrian energy distribution node, and was now drinking what she claimed was the best damn coffee in the galaxy, while simultaneously running quantum calculations that had taken Zephyrian scientists months to complete. Thexani approached the workstation where Chen and her Zephyrian counterpart, Science Officer Quexdal, were hunched over a three-dimensional hologram. The display showed the internal structure of a devourer, reconstructed from sensor data gathered during the recent battle. "Look at this," Chen said, pointing at a pulsing node deep within the creature's form. "We think this is how they control their phase-shifting ability. It's like a biological dimensional anchor, but instead of keeping them locked in normal space, it lets them hop between dimensions at will." Quexdal's crest feathers rustled with excitement. "The energy signatures are fascinating. They're using what appears to be controlled exotic matter decay to create temporary rifts in space-time. It's incredibly sophisticated, far beyond anything we've encountered before." "But here's the kicker," Chen continued, her eyes bright with the kind of manic enthusiasm that Thexani had come to associate with human engineers. "We think we can disrupt it, not with dimensional resonance bombs. Those are too crude and affect everything in the area. Targeted quantum interference?" She manipulated the hologram, zooming in on the mysterious node. "See these wave patterns? They have to maintain perfect resonance to keep the dimensional rifts stable. But if we can introduce a counterfrequency at exactly the right moment, the phase shift would collapse catastrophically," Quexdal finished, his voice filled with awe. "The creature would be trapped permanently in normal space-time." Thexani felt a thrill of possibility. How quickly can this be weaponized? That's the beautiful part. Chen grinned. "We don't need to build new weapons. We can modify existing ship sensors to broadcast the interference patterns. Every ship in the fleet could become a devourer suppression platform." It was typical of human thinking. Instead of designing a complex new weapon system that would take months to manufacture and deploy, they were adapting existing technology to serve multiple purposes. Crude, perhaps, but undeniably effective. Similar breakthroughs were occurring throughout the fleet. Human industrial engineers were working with Zephyrian material scientists to develop new hull composites that could resist dimensional distortion. Human weapons specialists were collaborating with Zephyrian physicists to create ammunition that could track targets across multiple dimensions. Most remarkably, human programmers were somehow managing to integrate their chaotic, intuitive coding styles with Zephyrian logical algorithms, producing AI systems that were both more creative and more reliable than either species could have achieved alone. The process wasn't without its challenges. Cultural differences created constant friction. Humans were direct to the point of rudeness by Zephyrian standards, while Zephyrians were formal to the point of being incomprehensible to human sensibilities. There were arguments, misunderstandings, and at least 3 incidents that required Admiral Harrison and Thexani to personally intervene to prevent actual violence. But somehow, it was working. The combined fleet was becoming something greater than the sum of its parts, a hybrid force that incorporated the best aspects of both species' military traditions while discarding the limitations that had held each back. The breakthrough came on the 4th day when the hunt for the Devourer tracking signal finally bore fruit. Thexani was in the command center when Vexara burst in, her normally composed demeanor shattered by excitement and horror in equal measure. "Commander, we found it. The signal. It's not coming from our ship. It's coming from inside our crew." The words hit the command center like a physical blow. Human and Zephyrian officers alike stopped their work, turning to stare at the communications officer with expressions of shock and disbelief. "Explain," Thexani ordered, her voice deadly calm. Vexara activated a holographic display that showed the internal structure of the crystalline dawn. Pulsing dots indicated the location of every crew member, their positions updated in real time by the ship's internal sensors. But one dot was different from the others. It pulsed with the same malevolent frequency they had detected in the Devourer tracking signal. "Medical Officer Zexani," Vexara whispered. "The signal is coming from her neural implant." Zexani's world seemed to tilt on its axis. Zexani was her sister, her closest friend, her most trusted advisor. They had served together for over 2 decades, had fought side by side in dozens of battles across the galaxy. The idea that she could be working with the Devourers was unthinkable. "It could be involuntary," Admiral Harrison said quietly. The human commander had been listening from his own ship, connected by quantum communication link. If the Devourers can manipulate reality on a fundamental level, they might be able to influence biological systems as well. "Your sister might not even know she's been compromised." The possibility was both terrifying and oddly comforting. If Zexani was being controlled against her will, then she wasn't truly a traitor. She was another victim of the Devourer's impossible hunger. "We need to investigate immediately," Thexani said. "If the Devourers can influence our personnel, then no one is safe." The confrontation took place in the ship's medical bay, with both human and Zephyrian security personnel standing ready. Zexani looked up from her work as they entered, her expression shifting from surprise to confusion to dawning horror as she realized why they were there. "Sister," she whispered, using the informal address they had shared since childhood. "What is the meaning of this?" "Zexani, we've detected a signal coming from your neural implant," Thexani said gently. "A signal that matches the frequency used by the Devourers to track our fleet." The medical officer's eyes widened in shock, her crest feathers flattening against her skull in a gesture of extreme distress. "That's impossible. I would know if my implant had been compromised. I would feel it." "Not necessarily," said Dr. James Patterson, one of the human medical specialists who had been studying Zephyrian physiology. The elderly physician had the kind of bedside manner that transcended species boundaries, calm, reassuring, but utterly honest about difficult truths. "If the alteration was made on a quantum level, it might not register in your conscious awareness." He activated a portable medical scanner, running it over Zexani's implant site. The device immediately began emitting warning tones, its display showing readings that made both human and Zephyrian medical personnel step back in alarm. "The implant has been fundamentally altered," Patterson said grimly. "The original neural interface is still there, but it's been infected, for lack of a better word. There are quantum structures integrated into the circuitry that shouldn't be possible with current technology." "How long?" Thexani asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Patterson consulted his readings. "Based on the level of integration, I'd say the alteration began approximately 6 months ago. It would have been gradual, imperceptible to normal medical scans." 6 months. The timeline matched perfectly with the Zephyrian Armada's first encounter with the Devourers. The creatures hadn't just been hunting them, they had been preparing, infiltrating, turning their own technology against them. "Can it be removed?" Zexani asked, her voice shaking with the effort of maintaining composure. Patterson exchanged a look with his Zephyrian counterpart. "The quantum structures are integrated at a cellular level. Removing them would require significant neural surgery. The risks are extreme." "Do it," Zexani said immediately. "I won't be used as a weapon against my own people." The surgery took 18 hours and required the combined expertise of both human and Zephyrian medical teams. Patterson and his human colleagues provided innovative surgical techniques that had been developed from decades of battlefield medicine, while the Zephyrian doctors contributed their deep understanding of their species' unique neural architecture. Thexani waited outside the operating theater, pacing back and forth with a restless energy that was completely unlike her normally composed demeanor. Admiral Harrison had come aboard personally to wait with her, the scarred human commander sitting quietly in one of the medical bay's chairs, sipping coffee from a portable thermal unit. "You know," Harrison said during one of Thexani's pacing circuits, "this actually gives us an advantage." Thexani stopped and turned to stare at him. "How can you possibly see this as an advantage?" "My sister has been turned into an unwilling spy, and we have no way of knowing how many others might be compromised." "Because now we know how they've been tracking us," Harrison replied. "And more importantly, we know they need to be in our reality to do it. Those quantum structures in her implant, they're proof that the Devourers can't affect our universe from null space. They have to partially manifest in normal space-time to influence anything." The implications hit Thexani like a lightning bolt. "You're saying they have to become vulnerable to affect us?" "Exactly. And if they have to become vulnerable to spy on us, then they have to become vulnerable to attack us. Which means we can hurt them even when they think they're safely hidden in null space." Before Thexani could respond, the operating theater doors slid open and Dr. Patterson emerged, his surgical mask pulled down around his neck. His expression was grim, but there was satisfaction in his eyes. "The surgery was successful," he announced. "We were able to remove all the quantum structures without significant neural damage. Your sister is going to be fine, Commander." Relief flooded through Thexani like a physical wave. "Can I see her?" "She's still under anesthesia, but yes. Fair warning, though, the removal process seems to have triggered some kind of psychic backlash." While we were extracting the quantum structures, she began speaking in what sounded like the Devourer language. We recorded everything. Patterson handed her a datapad containing the audio files. "Our linguistic analysis teams are working on translation now, but from what we can tell, she was describing something called the final convergence. It sounds like the main Devourer fleet isn't just coming to destroy us. They're planning something much larger." Thexani activated the recording and listened to her sister's voice, distorted by anesthesia and speaking in harmonics that no Zephyrian throat should have been able to produce. The sounds were hauntingly beautiful and utterly terrifying at the same time. "What does it mean?" she asked. Harrison's expression had grown deadly serious. "We're not entirely sure yet, but our best guess is that the Devourers aren't just trying to consume our galaxy. They're trying to use it as a gateway to consume every galaxy in the observable universe. The final convergence appears to be some kind of reality-altering event that will let them access parallel dimensions on a massive scale." The scope of the threat was almost incomprehensible. They weren't just fighting for their own lives, or even for their own galaxy. They were fighting for the survival of all life, everywhere, across all possible realities. But as Thexani looked around the medical bay, seeing human and Zephyrian personnel working together with a level of cooperation that should have taken centuries to develop, she felt that familiar spark of hope returning. "How long do we have?" she asked. Harrison consulted his chronometer. 17 days until the main fleet arrives." "But Commander, there's something else. While your sister was unconscious, she kept repeating a set of coordinates." "We think she might have been given information about the Devourer's staging area, the place where they're gathering their forces before the final assault." Thexani felt her pulse quicken. "A staging area means they're still in normal space-time, still vulnerable. That's what we're hoping. The coordinates point to a system about 4 days' travel from here. If we can mount a preemptive strike, we might be able to disrupt their invasion before it begins." Thexani finished. "Admiral, how quickly can your fleet be ready to move?" Harrison's scarred face split into that familiar, terrifying grin. "Commander, we've been ready since the moment we arrived. The question is, are your people prepared to take the fight to the enemy?" Thexani looked through the observation window at her sister, lying peacefully in the recovery bed, finally free from the alien influence that had turned her into an unwilling weapon. Then she thought about the thousands of human personnel who had died in the previous battle, sacrificing themselves for people they had never met. "Admiral, my people have spent centuries believing we were the greatest military force in the galaxy. It took your species to show us what true strength really looks like. We'll follow you into hell itself if that's what it takes to stop these creatures." Harrison nodded, his expression becoming businesslike. "Good. Because that's exactly where we're going." The Xerion system had once been home to a thriving civilization of silicon-based life forms who had built their cities inside the crystalline cores of asteroids. Their art had been famous throughout the sector, their poetry translated into hundreds of languages, their philosophy studied by scholars from dozens of species. Now it was a graveyard. Commander Thexani stood on the bridge of the crystalline dawn, watching the tactical display with a mixture of horror and strategic fascination. The system's asteroid belt, once a beautiful constellation of inhabited crystal formations, had been converted into something that defied every known principle of space-time physics. The Devourers hadn't just consumed the Xerian civilization. They had used their remains to build a staging area that existed partially outside normal reality. Massive structures that hurt to look at directly floated in impossible formations throughout the system, their geometry shifting and writhing as they phased in and out of null space. The very fabric of reality was weaker here, torn and stretched by the presence of creatures that had no right to exist. "Final sensor sweep complete," reported Tactical Officer Nexthor, his normally steady voice tight with strain. "We're detecting approximately 50,000 Devourers in the system, ranging from scout-sized entities to, gods preserve us, something that's nearly the size of a small moon." Admiral Harrison's voice crackled over the communication link from his flagship. "How long until they complete whatever they're building?" "Unknown," Thexani replied, studying the alien constructions on the display. "But based on the energy patterns we're detecting, I estimate they need another 72 hours to reach full operational capacity." The plan they had developed was insane, even by human standards, which was saying something. Instead of trying to engage the massive Devourer force in conventional battle, they were going to attempt to disrupt the staging area itself, essentially attacking the creature's ability to remain partially anchored in null space. The key to the plan was a combination of human audacity and Zephyrian precision. Human ships would penetrate deep into the system, drawing the Devourers into normal space-time by threatening their staging area. Meanwhile, Zephyrian vessels equipped with modified quantum interference arrays would target the dimensional anchor points that allowed the alien structures to exist. It was going to require perfect timing, absolute coordination, and a level of trust between the two species that had never existed before. The margin for error was essentially zero. "All ships report ready for Operation Pandemonium," Harrison announced, and Thexani had to suppress a laugh at the human naming convention. Where Zephyrian military operations were given dignified names like Stellar Harmony or Crystal Convergence, humans seemed to delight in naming their plans after concepts of chaos and destruction. "Remember, people," Harrison continued, his voice carrying across both fleets, "we're not trying to win a traditional battle here. We're trying to collapse their entire dimensional infrastructure. Hit hard, hit fast, and whatever happens, don't let them complete their convergence ritual." The combined fleet began its approach, moving in a formation that would have been impossible for either species to achieve alone. Human ships provided the brute force and heavy weapons, while Zephyrian vessels contributed precision targeting and advanced sensors. The integration was so seamless that it looked like they had been designed to work together from the beginning. As they entered the outer edge of the Xerian system, reality began to behave strangely. Navigation instruments fluctuated wildly as space-time itself bent around the Devourer constructions. Several human ships reported that their clocks were running backward, while a Zephyrian destroyer found itself temporarily existing in 3 different dimensions simultaneously. "This is Captain Rodriguez of the Indomitable," came a voice over the communication array. "My crew is aging in reverse, and we've got gravity flowing upward. Just thought everyone should know." "Copy that, Rodriguez," Harrison replied with remarkable calm. "Try not to become babies before we finish the mission." The first contact with enemy forces came when they were still 3 hours out from the main staging area. A swarm of smaller Devourers emerged from null space, their forms flickering and shifting as they moved to intercept the approaching fleet. "Remember, don't let them phase out," Thexani commanded, activating the quantum interference systems. The modified sensors throughout the combined fleet began broadcasting the counter-frequencies they had developed, creating a web of dimensional disruption that forced the Devourers to remain in normal spacetime. The battle that followed was unlike anything in recorded military history. Human weapons, crude but devastating, tore through Devourer forms that had been locked into solid matter by Zephyrian quantum manipulation. The creatures fought back with weapons that violated the laws of physics, shooting beams of pure entropy and launching projectiles that traveled backward through time. "Target bearing 27 Mark IV is firing causality rounds," reported one of the human gunners with remarkable nonchalance. "My shots are being uncaused before I fire them." "Switch to quantum torpedoes," Harrison ordered. "If they want to play with time, let's show them what temporal paradoxes really look like." The quantum torpedoes were a perfect example of human Zephyrian cooperation. The warheads used human antimatter technology to create the necessary destructive force, while Zephyrian temporal manipulation systems ensured that the explosions occurred at multiple points in the timeline simultaneously. The result was devastation that the Devourers, for all their reality-warping abilities, found impossible to defend against. But the real objective lay deeper in the system, where the main Devourer force was putting the finishing touches on their dimensional convergence machine. The device, if it could even be called that, was a structure that existed in 17 dimensions at once, its purpose apparently to create a permanent gateway between null space and normal reality. If they complete that thing, Harrison said grimly, they'll be able to bring their entire species into our universe without having to phase shift. They'll be untouchable. The approach to the convergence machine required running a gauntlet of increasingly powerful Devourers. These were not the relatively small creatures they had fought before, but ancient entities that seemed to be made of condensed space-time itself. They didn't just attack the approaching ships, they attacked the concept of the ship's existence, trying to erase them from reality on a fundamental level. Human and Zephyrian crews worked together to counter these ontological attacks, using a combination of brute force and exotic physics that shouldn't have been possible. When the USS Defiance began to fade from existence, the Zephyrian cruiser Eternal Vigilance used its reality anchors to keep it locked in normal space. When the Crystal Harmony found itself trapped in a temporal loop, the human destroyer Stubborn Bastard fired its entire missile complement into the past to break the cycle. The names alone told the story of their alliance. Human ships with aggressive, defiant names working alongside Zephyrian vessels with poetic, philosophical designations. It should have been oil and water, but instead it was creating something entirely new. They reached the convergence machine with less than an hour to spare. The structure was enormous, easily the size of a small space station, and its very presence made reality around it unstable. Several crew members throughout the fleet reported seeing dead relatives experiencing memories that belonged to other people, or suddenly acquiring knowledge of languages they had never learned. Zephyrian scanners are detecting the convergence threshold at 97%, Thexani reported. Whatever we're going to do, we need to do it now. The assault on the convergence machine was everything they had learned about human Zephyrian cooperation, distilled into its most concentrated form. Human ships provided covering fire, while Zephyrian vessels deployed their quantum interference arrays at precisely calculated points around the structure. The timing had to be perfect. If the interference patterns weren't synchronized to within nanoseconds, the machine would simply phase into another dimension where their weapons couldn't reach it. Interference pattern Alpha is in position, reported Vexara. Beta pattern ready, came another voice. Gamma pattern locked, called a third. Harrison's scarred face appeared on the communication screen. All stations, this is it. On my mark, we're going to hit this thing with everything we've got. Remember, we only get one shot at this. Thexani found herself holding her breath, along with probably every other being in both fleets. On the tactical display, she could see the convergence machine's power levels continuing to climb. 98%. 99.
Mark! Harrison shouted.
The combined fleet opened fire with every weapon they possessed. Human kinetic rounds and energy beams slammed into the structure while Zephyrium quantum disruptors targeted its dimensional anchor points. The quantum interference arrays activated simultaneously, creating a web of intersecting frequencies that forced the machine to remain in normal space-time. For a moment, it looked like it was working. The convergence machine's power levels began to fluctuate, its impossible geometry starting to destabilize. Several sections of the structure simply vanished as their anchor points were severed from reality. Then the largest devourer they had yet encountered emerged from the heart of the machine. The creature was vast beyond comprehension, its form shifting between states of matter that had no names. It moved through space like a living shadow, and wherever it passed, the very concept of existence became negotiable. Two human ships simply stopped being real when it looked at them. A Zephyrian cruiser found itself transformed into a theoretical construct that existed only in mathematical equations. By all the gods of the crystal realm, whispered Nextor. How do we fight something like that? The answer came from the most unlikely source. Deep in the bowels of the human flagship, Chief Engineer Maria Santos had been listening to the battle reports while working on a project that had nothing to do with the current crisis. She had been trying to integrate human coffee-making technology with Zephyrian quantum food synthesis, and had accidentally created something that violated several fundamental laws of physics. Admiral! Her voice crackled over the communication array. I think I know how to hurt that thing. Talk to me, Chief, Harrison replied, not taking his eyes off the approaching horror. It's all about quantum states, sir. That thing exists in multiple realities at once, right? But what if we forced it to exist in only one reality? What if we made it completely, absolutely real? There was a moment of silence as the implications sank in. Chief, are you suggesting we use your quantum coffee maker as a weapon? Not exactly, sir. But the principle is the same. If we can bombard that creature with quantum coherence fields, we might be able to force it into a single, stable reality. And once it's locked into normal space-time, we can kill it with conventional weapons. Thexani finished, understanding immediately. The plan required every ship in both fleets to reconfigure their quantum systems to broadcast coherence fields instead of interference patterns. It was insanely dangerous. If they miscalculated, they might accidentally make the Devourer more powerful instead of less. But with the convergence machine approaching full activation, they were running out of options.
All ships, this is Harrison. You heard the chief.
We're going to force this thing to become real, then we're going to kill it with prejudice. Zephyrian vessels, configure your quantum systems for maximum coherence output. Human ships, prepare all kinetic weapons for rapid fire. The giant Devourer seemed to sense what they were planning. It began moving more erratically, trying to phase completely into null space before they could lock it down. But the creature's very size worked against it. Something that massive couldn't phase shift quickly. Coherence fields activating, Vexara reported. Weapons hot, called out every human gunner simultaneously. Fire! Harrison commanded. The quantum coherence fields hit the giant Devourer like a net made of solidified reality. For the first time since the battle had begun, the creature became completely, undeniably real. Its impossible form collapsed into something that, while still alien and terrifying, obeyed the normal laws of physics, and once it was bound by the laws of physics, human weapons could destroy it. The barrage that followed was magnificent and terrible. Every human ship in the fleet emptied its magazines into the now solid creature, while Zephyrian energy weapons added their own precise devastation to the assault. Nuclear warheads, antimatter torpedoes, kinetic rounds, particle beams, and quantum disruptors all struck the Devourer simultaneously. The creature died badly, screaming across frequencies that existed in dimensions most beings couldn't perceive. Its death throes sent shockwaves through reality itself, causing the convergence machine to overload catastrophically. The explosion that followed was visible from 3-star systems away. When the light finally faded and space-time finished rearranging itself back into normal configurations, the Zirian system was empty except for the combined human-Zephyrian fleet. The Devourers were gone. The convergence machine was gone. Even the strange, impossible structures that had dotted the system were gone, erased from existence along with their creators. "Status report," Thexani called out, her voice hoarse from the strain of the battle. "All ships reporting in," Nexthor replied. "Heavy damage throughout the fleet, but no total losses. The quantum backlash from the convergence machine's destruction seems to have disrupted the remaining Devourer's ability to maintain coherence. They're retreating back toward the galactic rim." Admiral Harrison's face appeared on the communication screen, and for the first time since she had met him, the human commander looked genuinely exhausted. "Commander, our long-range sensors are detecting the main Devourer fleet. The good news is that without their staging area, they can't maintain their position in our galaxy. The bad news is that they're regrouping for what looks like one final all-or-nothing assault." Thexani nodded grimly. They had won a crucial victory, but the war was far from over. The Devourers would return, and when they did, it would be with everything they had left. But as she looked at the combined fleet, human and Zephyrian ships working together to repair damage and tend to wounded, she felt something that had been missing from her life for far too long. She felt ready. The final battle for the galaxy began at the edge of the Milky Way, in the vast emptiness between stars where space itself was thin and reality wore through like old fabric. The Devourers came not as individual creatures this time, but as a single, massive entity that stretched across light years, a living shadow that consumed starlight itself as it moved inexorably toward the galactic core. Commander Thexani stood on the bridge of the Crystalline Dawn, now serving as the flagship for the largest military force ever assembled in galactic history. In the 2 weeks since their victory at Zirian, word of the human-Zephyrian alliance had spread across known space like wildfire. Species that had been enemies for centuries were putting aside their differences to face the existential threat approaching from the void. The Cragthon Empire had arrived with their massive dreadnoughts, their crews still chanting war songs that could be heard across vacuum. The Stellar Confederacy's sleek battlecruisers hum in perfect formation beside the crystal ships of the Altarian Collective. Even the mysterious Voidwalkers had emerged from whatever dimension they normally inhabited, their impossible vessels defying every known law of physics. But at the heart of the Great Alliance were the humans and Zephyrians, their ships integrated so completely that it was difficult to tell where one fleet ended and the other began. Human engineering had merged with Zephyrian science to create weapons and defensive systems that neither species could have imagined alone. More importantly, their crews had merged as well, human pragmatism balancing Zephyrian precision, human intuition complementing Zephyrian logic. Final fleet count, Admiral Harrison announced from his position aboard the command vessel Unbreakable Spirit. The ship itself was a perfect symbol of their alliance, built around the skeletal framework of a Zephyrian heavy cruiser but packed with human weapons and defensive systems, crewed by both species working in perfect harmony. 47,000 ships representing 83 different civilizations, reported Fleet Coordinator Vexera. Every major power in the galaxy and most of the minor ones. It's the largest military force in recorded history. Thexani nodded, but her attention was focused on the long-range sensor displays. The approaching Devourer entity was unlike anything they had faced before. Where previous encounters had involved individual creatures that could be fought and defeated, this was something closer to a living galaxy, a consciousness so vast that it thought in geological time.
Analysis of the entity? She asked. Science Officer Quextall, now working alongside his human counterpart, Dr.
Patterson, in perfect collaboration, manipulated the holographic display to show their best understanding of their enemy's structure. It appears to be a collective consciousness formed from the remnants of every devourer we've encountered, plus thousands more that were waiting beyond the galactic rim. They've somehow merged into a single being that exists simultaneously across multiple dimensions. The good news, added Dr. Patterson, is that being so large makes it incredibly difficult for the entity to phase shift quickly. It's committed to operating primarily in normal space-time. The bad news, Quextall continued, is that its sheer size means it doesn't need to phase shift. It can absorb damage that would destroy entire fleets and barely notice. Admiral Harrison's scarred face appeared on the main communication screen. Commander, our scouts report that the entity will reach the outer colonies in approximately 18 hours. After that, it's a straight path to the galactic core. If we're going to make a stand, it has to be here. The plan they had developed was audacious even by the standards of human military thinking. Instead of trying to fight the massive entity directly, they were going to attempt something that had never been tried before in the history of warfare. They were going to convince it to fight itself. The key to the plan lay in intelligence gathered from Zigzani's traumatic experience with Devourer mental influence. The quantum structures that had been implanted in her neural system had left behind detailed information about how the creatures communicated and organized themselves. Most importantly, they had learned that the Devourer collective consciousness maintained its cohesion through quantum entanglement links between individual components. If we can disrupt those entanglement links, explained Lieutenant Chen, we might be able to cause the entity to fragment back into individual Devourers, and individual Devourers we can fight. The plan required every ship in the Alliance fleet to work in perfect coordination. They would need to position themselves throughout three-dimensional space around the massive entity, then simultaneously target specific quantum resonance points with precisely calibrated interference patterns. The timing would have to be exact to within nanoseconds across a battlefield that spanned multiple star systems. It was the kind of plan that required absolute trust between species that had been fighting each other for centuries. It required perfect communication across technological systems that had never been designed to work together. Most of all, it required the kind of desperate courage that could only come from knowing that failure meant the end of everything they had ever known or loved. All fleet commanders, this is Admiral Harrison, the human leader's voice carried across 47,000 ships. You all know what we're up against. You all know what happens if we fail. But I want you to remember something else. 6 months ago, most of us had never even heard of each other. Today, we're fighting as one people, one fleet, one family. We've already achieved the impossible just by being here. Now let's go achieve it again. The massive entity entered sensor range like a living eclipse, its presence causing reality to ripple and bend around it. The creature was so vast that it took several minutes for their instruments to map its full extent, and even then the readings were constantly changing as different parts of it phased in and out of multiple dimensions. When it spoke, its voice came from everywhere at once, transmitted through quantum frequencies that bypassed normal communication channels and spoke directly to the minds of every living being in the fleet. Smallones. You have caused great disruption to our feeding. This will end now. The first attacks came from appendages that stretched across light years, tentacles of living spacetime that could unravel the atomic structure of anything they touched. The Alliance fleet scattered, using tactics that had been developed through weeks of joint training exercises. Human ships provided mobile firepower, while Zephyrian vessels used their superior sensors to coordinate targeting. The other species contributed their own specialties. Kragthon ships absorbed incredible amounts of damage while Altarian vessels phase-shifted through attacks, but it quickly became clear that conventional weapons were having little effect. The entity was simply too large, too diffuse. Destroying one small section was like trying to kill an ocean by removing a single drop of water. "Initiate Operation Schism," Harrison commanded. The Great Fleet began moving into the formation they had practiced obsessively, positioning themselves at carefully calculated points around the massive entity. Each ship had been equipped with quantum interference generators tuned to specific frequencies, all designed to work together to disrupt the entanglement links that held the Devourer collective consciousness together. The entity seemed to sense what they were attempting. Its attacks became more focused, more desperate. Entire squadrons were consumed by writhing tentacles of corrupted space-time. The Kragthon dreadnought Eternal Fury simply ceased to exist when a concentrated blast of entropy struck its forward sections. But the fleet held formation. Human stubbornness combined with Zephyrian discipline and the unique strengths of dozens of other species to create something unprecedented. A military force that could absorb catastrophic losses while continuing to execute a plan of impossible complexity. "Interference generators at 90% power," reported Vexera. "All ships report ready," called out Harrison. "Target locks confirmed," added the Altarian fleet commander. "Quantum resonance patterns synchronized," announced Quexdal. Thexani looked around the bridge, seeing human and Zephyrian crew members working side by side with beings from across the galaxy. They were about to attempt something that no single species could have achieved alone, something that required the combined knowledge, courage, and determination of an entire galaxy's worth of civilizations. "Execute," she commanded. 47,000 ships fired simultaneously, their weapons targeting not the entity itself but the quantum bonds that held it together. The interference patterns intersected at precisely calculated points, creating a web of disruption that spread through the creature's vast form like cracks in breaking glass. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The massive entity began to fragment, its unified consciousness breaking apart into thousands of individual devourers. But these were not the relatively small creatures they had fought before. These were ancient beings that had been part of the collective for eons, each one the size of a small planet and filled with the accumulated hunger of countless consumed civilizations. The battle that followed defied description. Individual devourers, now freed from the collective consciousness that had constrained them, rampaged through the Allied fleet with desperate fury, but they were also vulnerable in ways they had never been before. Separated from their collective, they could no longer share information instantaneously or coordinate their attacks perfectly. The Alliance fleet adapted with stunning speed. Human captains led wild, aggressive attacks that kept the creatures off balance, while Zephyrian commanders provided the precise tactical coordination needed to exploit weaknesses. The other species contributed their own strengths. Voidwalker ships seemed to exist in multiple dimensions at once, striking at devourers from impossible angles, while Stellar Confederacy vessels used advanced AI systems to predict and counter the creature's reality-warping abilities. The tide of battle turned when Chief Engineer Santos, working aboard the Unbreakable Spirit, made an announcement that changed everything. "Admiral, I've been analyzing the quantum patterns from these individual devourers. They're not just fragmentae.